And then tub is all of Tibbles except 2.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. That's where shit gets wacky.
Yeah, that clicks at the end of class.
Good. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Okay. I don't have a lot of announcements. We're nearing the end of the semester. Things are doing fine. I'm planning to keep talking about this through Friday. We'll sort of assess how our discussion goes today. If you guys feel like we've talked the shit out of this topic and we're done, then we can reassess the no new reading for Friday, because we do have one more topic we can turn our attention to, namely the nature of possible worlds. I know some of you are writing on this topic for your papers, so I think it would be a fun one for us to talk about in class. But otherwise, I think there's still plenty to say about Tibbles and Tib, so that's what I plan to turn to. But before I do, are there any administrative questions? To repeat the announcement from last time, if you got an almost at level 2 on submission 4, I will allow you to submit your last submission at level 3, even though you didn't get to complete. So we're bending the rules a little. But please, before your paper begins, have a paragraph or like a cover page where you explain the correction you made to the level 2 submission, just so that I know you kind of saw my comment, why I said almost, and you addressed it. Does that make sense to everybody? I see some World Cup over there. Which game?
Tunisia and France.
Okay, what's the score?
Tunisia 1, France 0.
Oh, wow.
It's not doing so. France is not doing so well over here.
All right, we'll permit it for now. If it gets too distracting.
I'm not even looking at it.
It just happens to be on.
I only got 20 minutes. Yeah, it's about to be over anyway. All right, so let's quick review.
So remember, we are on to puzzles about change in parts. This is the other fundamental issue of change that we are considering in our kind of examination of what it means to be a physical object in time, right? And so our two main candidates are objects persist through time by enduring, being wholly present every time they exist, or by perduring, by having a distinct temporal part at every time they exist, right? So that's the kind of background here. I didn't write that up because clearly I need to replenish my markers. But I think that should now be fairly familiar to everybody. The puzzle we are addressing is called the puzzle of undetached parts. And I want to take a minute to just sort of make sure we understand why it's called that. Right? Because think of, and here it comes. We couldn't put it off forever. Here is Tibbles.
Give her some pupils this time. Last time she looked
I'm not sure I want to go there.
She looks like she's seen some shit. Oh my gosh, that's worse.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
All right. There she is, pupils and all. Okay, she's got some feet or something down here. All right. And then here's her tail. Okay. All right, so let's do it this way. Here is Tibbles at what we're just calling T0, namely the beginning of our particular little thought experiment, right? Okay. That's way worse with the pupils, man. That's better? Okay. I don't know. That creeps me out somehow. And this is coming back around to Taylor's question. So we identify a part of Tibbles, namely Oliver except her tail, that we take to be existing, right, at the same time, right? And so the reason we call this the puzzle of undetached parts is that while we're considering Tib as a part of Tibbles, right? Tib is not in some way physically separated. The tail is still attached. Tib is still attached to the tail. And so that's what we mean when we talk about undetached parts, just so we're clear. So it's kind of referring to the initial setup. So far, so good? And so the goal of the puzzle of undetached parts is to identify as clearly as we can, and as we saw, right? I mean, there are quite a few assumptions involved in thinking through change in parts over time. And the challenge in the end is going to be the following. If you adopt an endurance view of objects, it seems like you have to reject at least one of these assumptions, which all, now, this is where we'll pick up because it's about where we left off, but which all maybe on the face of it have some plausibility initially, and so rejecting one is taken to be some philosophical cost. Then the claim is going to be, and we started to see a hint of this in response to Jordan's question last time, but we can talk more about it today and Friday. The claim is going to be that a perdurance view of objects can preserve all of these assumptions, and instead what we do is we reject, we say at least one of these consequences doesn't follow from the assumptions, right? So we've got 6 assumptions. We claim that various consequences follow, but 2 of these consequences explicitly contradict one another. So that's why it seems like we've got to do something, because if those consequences follow from the assumptions and the consequences contradict one another, something's got to give. Right? Roughly what we covered last time. So pause now for questions, thoughts, concerns. We were starting to articulate, I think, Heider and Cal in particular, we're starting to question assumption 2. That's not the only assumption. Basically, I should say at the outset that for each of these 6 assumptions, you can find a philosopher who defends endurance who has rejected that assumption. So all 6 of these have been called into question by different philosophers at different points. And so I think we should consider any and all responses that occur to you.
I just had a question. So, when Tibbles loses the tail, doesn't that make Tibbles not Tibbles? Because, like, if you think of like an analogy over here, right? You think of the tail as a part of its identity. So, say if I had, a red car, and I scraped off the paint, it's now a gray car. So it's not a red car anymore, even though the gray car was a part of it. And so I just feel like once Tibbles loses the tail, it no longer exists as Tibbles, but it's now Tib.
So let's see here. So here is here is Tibbles at T1 after whatever traumatic event leads her to lose her tail. Okay. The claim is, this marker really is dying. Tib is still here. There's nothing happened to Tib. So I take it, either you want to say that, so you want to reject, you're now calling into question this consequence, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this consequence follows from 3, So you want to call into question the assumption that physical objects can gain and lose parts while remaining the same object. That's the thought. Okay, that is a kind of certainly one response. The result of rejecting that assumption is a version of a principle that we discussed briefly, but it was right before the break in response to Merrick's, the principle of mereological essentialism, that the parts of an object are essential to that object. So if an object has some parts, that object can't exist unless it has all those parts. Now, if you take that view seriously and you start to think about the kinds of things that we've been talking about, like, you know, hairs falling off, skin cells falling off, and whatnot, right? You are led quickly to the kind of flux doctrine of Heraclitus that objects don't persist through time at all, because we're always gaining and losing parts on some level, and so I am basically always a new object. Is that consequence acceptable?
I think there are some parts that that are necessary and others that are not, right? So, for instance, if you have a table and you remove its legs, no one's going to say it's a table now, it's just a flat piece of wood.
That sounds fine. So you want to say the tail is such a part of Tibbles?
Yeah.
What about this whisker?
Well, if you have a separate name for a cat that's Tibbles without the whisker, then it's not essential to it. Because, if I said Tibbles without a whisker is Dabble, and if you remove the whisker, it wouldn't matter. It would change her. But if there is no such named, separate object, then it doesn't matter whether I remove the whisker or not.
So naming Tib here is what makes this problematic. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Taylor, what?
I get what he's saying about like essential parts, especially with like the table. For example, if you remove all the legs, maybe it's not a table, but like I feel like if my cat was to lose her tail, maybe an ear, maybe an eye, maybe a leg, like she would still be my cat. That's what I intuitively want to say. Like maybe objects do persist through time, but they also change. Like I don't know. Like especially humans, it would take a lot. Like you can't become a new person. Is what I want to say. I don't know.
Just by losing an eyebrow or something.
Yeah. Even things like legs, arms, like it doesn't make you a different object.
Okay.
It makes you a handicapped human.
Yeah, but you're still like the same object. Like, I don't know.
I mean,
Your
but
essence is-
again, I think it's important to kind of we can like there are a range of cases, right? We can talk about losing a limb, but we can also, as I say, talk about losing, an eyebrow hair. I'm very fond of my eyebrow hairs, but sometimes my wife insists that I trim them, and so that's a loss of parts, right? And I think it is important, and I think, Taylor was bringing this up at the very beginning, right? We can consider all of Tibbles, but one particular hair somewhere on her shoulder, right? And it seems like an extreme claim to say that the loss of that part leads to an entirely new object, as opposed to the same object that has just changed over time. And I think so, but if we grant that, right? So, I mean, I think Taylor's point is a good one, right? Yes, some parts may be essential. If you remove my brain, probably not going to be quite the same object anymore. But others don't seem to be as essential. But once we grant that, then why can't we run the whole thought experiment with one of these agreed on non-essential parts? Right? And the other thing that I think was interesting, so you raised, if we name the whisker and name the cat without the whisker, then suddenly the whisker becomes essential in some way. I mean, we could do it without naming, anything. The naming is really just to make it easier to talk about. And so I'm curious as to why the naming of a part has this sort of metaphysical power to make that part essential. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like the whole idea of it having an identity has to do with it being assigned an identity, right?
Well, but remember, how are you using the word identity here?
What makes it something?
Yeah.
Something.
How are we using identity in our discussion? All right. Remember, for us, in our discussion, identity is just the being the same thing as. It's a relation that I have to myself and I don't have to you, right? But you have to yourself, right? And so the question, I guess what I want to try to emphasize is I think it's tempting to talk about identity in this way, but I'm not sure it's illuminating unless what you're just trying to say is, right? Yep, if you lose parts, you're no longer the same object. Because that's really what we're interested in, is the problem of change over time. And if this notion of identity is something that you think, well, we lose it when we lose a part, then you're just saying you're not the same object over time. And so I want to be cautious about putting too much weight on this notion of identity that I think you are tempted by right now. Does that make sense? Maybe it helps, but I think it also may distract us from what is kind of the source of the puzzle. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, that wasn't the most convincing yeah I've ever heard, but I think a few other people are weighing in and then we'll come back. Let's see, Cal, Jamie, Aiden.
So I think Hyder's entirely right. I think what it has to do with is the name.
Which part?
The thing about naming.
Okay.
So Tibbles, let's look at the name Tibbles and Tib. The name Tibbles is an entirely different kind of name than the name Tib. Tibbles refers to the whole thing, the real concrete object there, whereas Tib is just sort of this abstraction away from the real object and say, okay, now let's only consider the thing without some substantial part that it has as natural to it. And then you want to, and not you, but and then we want to draw all these logical conclusions on the fallacy that we're assuming Tib and Tibbles are the same kind of name. But I don't think they are. I think Tib is just sort of this mental projection of something we would ideally like to think about, but that doesn't represent anything in reality before the tail is cut off.
So good. So this, I think you are being consistent with your previous worry targeting this assumption, right? Because what you're saying is that Tib is not a physical object. Tib is at best an abstraction of some kind. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if thinking about that in terms of a difference in the names is the most illuminating, but I kind of see what you're doing.
I really only say that because I think the deeper point is that there's a difference between ideas about the thing and the thing itself.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I would say Tibbles is referring to the real thing itself, even though it's a name, whereas Tib is still a name, but it's not referring to anything real. So there's one that's cut off from reality, and then one that tries to capture reality.
So that's not real.
No, it's not that that's real, but the name doesn't refer to the concrete object that it's trying to refer to. Because the concrete object has a tail, but then you say, the name says, forget about it, even though it's there.
Can I refer to like the top part of this chair? Call it, I don't know, Bluey?
Yeah, sure, but that is not the same thing as the concrete object there. That's an abstraction away from its reality.
Pretty sure Bluey is concrete.
Well, it's not a part of the actual function, there is a whole object there, and then you break it down into parts, is what I'm saying. But
But do you want to say the parts don't exist?
no. I just want to say that the way we think about the object is already separated from the object itself. And so when you use names like this, you have to be very careful in not sort of overstaying your welcome, in not using the name Tib and then treating it as if there's a whole reality behind it.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by overstaying your welcome, but
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm doing it.
I mean, it's not. I don't know how else to say it. I don't think Tib is the same kind of process that Tibbles is doing. Like Tibbles is just the thing. You have to make a qualification about Tib.
I think the upshot here is still you don't like assumption too.
Yes.
I think that much is clear to me. Some of the rest is a little less clear, but I think Jamie, I think you were up.
I disagree with Cal because an example that I thought of is that my boyfriend's mom has this cat and it had to lose like one of its legs or something, and before that, like they called it like Murph or something, and then afterwards they like changed his name to like Tripod or something. And so like it's the same cat, but like they changed the name of it and it lost a part, but like it's still the same cat.
Okay. The question, so good. That's a good example. Could they have introduced the name tripod before the cat lost its leg to talk about all of the cat but that leg? Does that?
Well, you could still like change a name if they had changed it to something else, like not related to the fact that it has 3 legs. Like,
but so changing the name is fine. But
Yeah.
the twist is that the name Tib here is not taken to refer to the whole cat,
just the cat without the tail.
the cat without the tail.
Okay.
But at the time that the cat still has the tail. So let's try to dramatize this in a way that makes it a little maybe more intuitive. So I don't know, I don't know if this is genetically possible for cats, but let's suppose that you have a gray cat that has an orange tail. Okay? Right? And you find yourself thinking, I kind of wish the whole cat was the color that the cat's tail is. Right? And so you find yourself saying, look, the color of the gray part of the cat, that's fine. Right? I wish I had a way of talking about the gray part of the cat. I'll call the gray part of the cat Tib. Right? And I'll call the orange part of the cat tail. And then you can say, I like the color of tail more than I like the color of Tib. Does that seem, why would you want to do that? I'm not, but is it at least kind of a coherent way to talk? Right? But then it seems like you're talking about physical objects. The tail and all of the cat but the tail. Does that seem?
But Tibbles is the whole cat. Tibbles
True.
isn't just the tail.
True.
And I think the thing I don't like is that we're making logical conclusions based off of the arbitrary abstraction of Tib, because it's not as if we can't change the name, but insofar as Tibbles still is there and has the tail, Tib is just a name on top of that.
But as I say, if the cat is gray and the tail is orange, then it's not arbitrary anymore. Then, right? Then it's very useful to talk about.
But you can't
Tib.
necessarily draw a metaphysical conclusion based off that.
Oh, I do that shit all the time. Let's see. Aiden, I think, was up, and then Jamie, and then Taylor, and then Hyder, and have I missed anybody? Okay.
This is kind of a different thought than what others are interested in
Okay.
as far as naming is concerned. But I was looking at kind of the consequences here, and number 3 stuck out to me. And I think in order to take kind of a predurantist line of thinking, shouldn't we reject number 3 because predurant states that we like me yesterday is totally different from me today. So Tib at one time can't be Tib at a later time.
Good. I think, so this is a version, I think, of Jordan's question from Monday. And the answer is, that's one way that a perdurantist might go. And that would apply to both of these equally, right?
Yeah.
Because in both cases, for that argument to work, the assumption has to be that for a perdurantist, a phrase like Tib at T1 refers to the temporal part at T1.
Oh, okay.
And that's fine. That's a natural assumption to make.
Yeah.
But it's not the only assumption, right? It's not the only thing that a perdurantist could say.
Okay.
Okay? And again, so we'll come back to that, but that is one way for a perdurantist to respond. You can say, I keep all of these assumptions, but because a phrase like Tibbles at T0 and Tibbles at T1, those are talking about two distinct temporal parts, right? This claim doesn't follow, and this claim doesn't follow. And so that's one way that a perdurantist can say, I like all of these, but I don't have a contradiction.
Yeah.
So yes, so that's fine. And as I say, this was the point that Jordan raised last time, and I think that's right.
Okay.
Again, if that's what you take phrases like that to mean as a perdurantist. The other option is that the phrase Tibbles at T0 means something like the thing that is Tibbles and has a part at a temporal part at T0.
Yeah.
And then you're referring to the whole space-time worm.
Right.
But then these identity statements are plausibly true. Right? The thing that is Tibbles and has a part at T0 is, well, the same space-time worm that has a part at T1.
Yep.
Right. So then you have to reject a different claim, but we could talk about that
Sure.
in a bit. Whew. Okay. So who was up? Taylor, I think, was up.
I was thinking about like nicknames. It doesn't make sense now. My cat has like 13 nicknames. So I don't know how to phrase what I was gonna ask. Like, I don't know. Sometimes her name's Mimosa, but
That's a good name.
it was on Finder. So when she scratches on her cat tree, she kind of looks like a bear, and so I started calling her Sosa Bear. If she was to like stop doing that or like lose her legs, maybe I wouldn't call her that anymore. So I don't know.
I think that's awesome. We had a cat named Josephine when I was growing
Aw.
up, and through a succession of nicknames, the one that finally stuck was Weedles.
That's how
was
Mimosa's are. She's
that was-
all over the place.
that was her name that stuck. But yes, so I totally get that. Like nicknames can change.
Yeah. I just feel like it's not that important to, because if she has 13 different names, then it doesn't really matter, like, if we name certain parts of it. I don't know how to word it.
Good. Okay. Good. Let's see, Jamie, you did have your hand up and kind of in response to some of the back and forth, I think. So I wanted to give you a chance to weigh back in.
I'm a little confused because, like, so you can call Tibbles Tib at T0 if you're referring to everything but the tail, or is it just that he gains the name Tib when he loses the tail?
So the way I'm thinking of the case, and the way that you kind of have to think of the case to generate the puzzle, is that the name Tib at this time, so, here is T0, here is T1, and let me just get rid of this shit. Right. So, these are just now two different times. So far, so good. All right. So the way to think about it that generates the puzzle is that at this time you've got a cat named Tibbles. All right. And when you talk about Tibbles, you're talking about the whole cat. And then for some reason, maybe your cat has an orange tail and a gray body, you introduce a separate name, not for the whole cat. Right? So it's not like the nickname case where you're just calling the same cat by a different name, but rather you introduce a name to talk about a particular part of the cat. So again, right, you say, well, I need a name to talk about the gray part of Tibbles, so I'm going to use the word Tib as a name for the gray part of Tibbles, right, which happens to be all of Tibbles but her tail. So the name Tib is really, right, at this time, it's talking about a different object. Because Tib doesn't have a tail, right? Because Tib is, by definition, all of Tibbles except her tail. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so in the second one, like, when she loses the tail, it's still, they talk about the same thing, but because of, like, a different circumstance.
And so that's the challenge, right? Right, what makes this a puzzling case is that here at one time you seem to have, setting Cal's worries aside, two distinct physical objects, right? Tibbles and Tib are not the same object. At a later time, when Tibbles loses her tail, right, it seems like somehow those two objects have fused into one, because there's just one thing here, the thought is, that is somehow both Tibbles and Tib. So that's what is supposed to make this challenging, right? Is that somehow two distinct objects become the same object. And, right? So that's why this is sometimes called a case of, well, that's supposed to be an F. A case of fusion of objects, right? Because we start with 2 and we seem to end up with 1. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah. For me, though, like, I just, like, I kind of, for me, it's like, after he loses his tail, I mean, there's no tail to talk about, so of course, like, whatever's remaining is still Tibbles. But if you, like, had previously called just the body of Tib, like, now they do talk about the same thing, because there isn't anything else. Yeah. Yeah,
that seems, oh no, sorry, here. That seems to be right?
Yeah.
At time T1, seems like there's just one object there.
Yeah, so
Right.
I don't.
So what's the problem? Right? The problem is that if these are identity statements. One thing equals another, one thing equals another. If you chain these statements together, right, look at the structure of this. So here you have A equals B, and what is this? C equals D, and now what have we got? We're saying B equals D, and now you can start linking these things together to get, right? But up here we're saying A doesn't equal B. That's the fusion problem. You seem to start out with distinct objects, but if objects can stay the same over time, and then we end up with just one object, something very mysterious has happened. That's the puzzle of change. Does that?
Yeah.
Good. And so, again, what we're doing here by listing these assumptions is trying to clarify as much as we can what is our natural way of thinking about objects that gives rise to this puzzle. Does that help?
Yeah. For me, like, looking at the fourth assumption, I think it's interesting to say Tib survives Tibbles' loss of her tail. Because in that, it's separated them into, like, the body of Tib and, like, the whole of Tibbles and her tail. So, like, I don't know. I just...
Okay. Skyly's nodding at that.
Because, like, in that sentence specifically, you've, like, separated the parts, but also, when you look at how they survive the tail, I mean, Tibbles is still there, but I guess it is a different understanding of Tibbles. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, this is what we're wrestling with. I do want to say one thing here that is relevant to what Jamie just brought up. I'm using survives here very loosely as just shorthand for continues to exist through the process, not in the sense of living things surviving. I just want to be clear that that's just a shorthand for a more general way of talking. Okay, a whole bunch of hands have come up. Hyder, though, was kind of next in line for a little while, so I'm going to let him weigh in, and then I think Sean and Jamie and Nikki. Yeah, okay.
Well, so I was just thinking about the fifth assumption over there, which says there can only be one object.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking back to when you know, earlier you said the whole thing about the statue and the clay.
Mm-hmm.
And well, even there you have like the statue and clay as two separate objects which take the exact same space.
That's certainly one response to the statue and clay, and that is, so this is a commonly rejected assumption.
Yeah, I think you can have two things in the same place at the same time.
Okay. You don't think that gets a little crowded?
I mean, not necessarily. The statue's proof for it.
Okay. So here we're starting to question this one. I like it. Okay. Sean, I think was.
Yeah. So going off of what Jamie said, I think 4 is the assumption that I'd probably reject.
Okay.
Because I don't think Tib does survive.
Okay.
After,
Why not?
Tib.
Why not?
Because Tib doesn't. The thing that I think is that Tib kind of refers to exactly what Tibbles is at that point. So there's no need to even have a Tib because it's just redundant.
Okay.
So wouldn't that be like an Occam's razor situation where there's too many things in your ontology at that point? There's not even a point of having a Tib.
Oh, that's an interesting way to argue. I mean, I think the whether it's an Occam's razor intuition, I mean, I think the underlying idea is just like the kind of notion that I just was mentioning in response to Hyder of a kind of overcrowding, right? What it makes it's weird to talk about two objects being in the same place at the same time, modulo whether, right? Whether that's an Occam's razor challenge or not, I'm actually not sure, but it's an interesting way to make the argument. I guess the question becomes, what happens to Tib? If Tib doesn't survive, what happens to, I don't want to say necessarily her, but what happens to it? What happens to Tib?
I guess I'd just say it disappears because there's no need for it. It just becomes Tibbles at that point.
Okay. So it's not a case of fusion, it's a case of one object just poof going out of existence. Okay. Let's see, Jamie, Taylor, Nikki, I think. Yeah? Jamie, you're, not Jamie. Quincy, you had your hand up, sorry. This table. This is the talk.
I wanted to, for my own brain, change the example really quick just to make sure that I'm actually understanding what you're talking about. So maybe instead of, my brain's going to how like there's the United Kingdom, but then there's also the British Commonwealth, where it's like the UK, and it's way more complicated, but for my brain it's helping me. The UK is like England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and that's like an actual country. And then the British Commonwealth is all of its old like territories, but like Canada and Australia, where they still are under like now the king. But like if they all left, the UK would still be the British Commonwealth because it's still all of the countries that recognize the king, no matter how many countries are in it or not. Kind of like Russia and the Soviet Union, I guess, where it's like they were there before. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm just making sure that I understand what you mean.
That is an interesting case to try to build the analogy. Let's see. So at time zero, there is a political object, let's say, that is the Commonwealth. At time t0, there's a political object that is a part of the Commonwealth, namely the UK. Political objects can gain and lose territory while remaining the same object. UK survives the Commonwealth's loss of Canada and Australia and wherever else, there can be only one political object exactly occupying a given region at a time. That my intuitions start to give out there a little bit, I have to confess. I'm not sure that works as well. So possibly, but I think it's tricky. Other cases, so another case where this kind of structure comes up that's interesting is, so think about a committee, right, gaining and losing members. To what extent is it the same committee anymore, right? So you can come up with other examples that behave structurally similarly, but whether they behave exactly the same way, I'm not always sure, and it would require pretty careful conceptual examination sometimes. Does that make sense, Quincy? I think it's a really interesting example, but you get into sort of tricky political questions, perhaps, with some of these other cases. But I think, and other, certainly we can articulate versions of these other assumptions that way. And then, as I say, my intuitions give out in some cases a little more than others. Taylor had a hand up.
I was just going to ask about the validity of the fifth assumption, because at T0, aren't there two objects in that little square that you drew? And then at T prime, there's also two objects. So how can we assume 5 when we're drawing the exact opposite?
Well, 5 seems to follow from 2, 3, and 4, and the claim that identity is transitive. If A equals B, B equals D, and C equals D, then we get all the way from A to, I'm using B's all in the wrong places here, aren't I? God damn it. That's supposed to be a C, isn't it?
I wasn't even looking at that. I was just looking at the cat.
But
it seems like there's two objects in one region of space at a time.
So and that's, so that's the way,
Is that?
that's rejecting 5.
Yeah.
And that is a response that people make. Yep. Nikki.
Okay. Well, Taylor kind of said the main thing that I was also thinking of as well, but let me see. There's something else. Yeah, no, I'm good.
You're good?
Yeah.
All right.
I think so.
All right. I think this is a good place to pause. We're at the end of our session, basically. So we'll talk about this a little more. I think there's still things to say kind of about, we've questioned each of these. I guess maybe Hyder was questioning that one too at one point in the discussion. So we're lining them up here. So let's pick up here. Think about, I guess maybe between now and Friday, think about how you would defend each of these assumptions from the kinds of questions that have been coming up. Because, right, to some extent this is only a puzzle if we think all 6 assumptions are somehow worth keeping. If you really think at least one of them is just bullshit, then there's not a problem anymore. And so I think that's where we should maybe begin.